All right, so we're going to discuss responsibility in engineering. So you can think of responsibility as being a concept that's tied closely to the notion of blame. If you're responsible for an action, and the idea here is that you're also blameworthy for it. And so we're going to look at various aspects of responsibility and when engineers are responsible and at times when they're not responsible. In other words, we'll be looking at times when engineers are rightly blamed for doing a certain action or a certain inaction, and at times when they're not blameworthy. So responsibility and this notion of responsibility can fall on the individual engineer, and from here on out, I'll be using shorthand, capital E for engineering or for engineer. But blame or responsibility, it can fall on the individual agent, right, the individual engineer, or it can fall on the team, like a team of engineers working together. It can fall on a larger group, a division, or it can fall on an entire organization. An entire organization might be blameworthy. And so we can think of the degrees of taking into account care and kind of trying to be morally responsible in your actions. We can think of it as being a spectrum. So engineers, for example, can do the bare minimum to get by and stay out of trouble. But then they can do more than that, right? They can go a little bit further in making sure, for example, that their product or their project that they're working on is safe for others. And they can go, there can be even further extremes, and to the point where we can say that an engineer is going the extra mile, right? Sometimes engineers work extra just to make sure that a certain product is safe and won't threaten human life. So in the profession, engineers are expected to do more than the bare minimum. So engineers are expected to do much more than just do what's barely enough, which is just passes the bare sufficiency threshold of being enough to get by and not get in trouble. So recall that the engineering code of ethics is very high, right? It calls upon engineers to exercise and exemplify integrity. And exemplifying integrity means that engineers should go do more than just the bare minimum to make sure that their projects or products they're working on are safe for others. Okay, so next we have here this notion of the standard of care, and this notion of standard of care is widespread and rampant in engineering ethics as well as in law when it comes to legal cases against engineers. So engineers must follow standard operating procedures and regulations first of all, right? That's one thing, of course, engineers morally should do, is that they should follow the standard operating procedures, regulations, guidelines, go through the the standard steps and procedures, for example, to make sure that the product is safe. However, unexpected problems can arise that are not addressed in the standard operating procedures. So it's not the case that if you just follow the standard operating procedures that that's enough, because there can be some unexpected problems that might arise when working on a particular project that is not itself clearly addressed in the standard operating procedures. So this usually standard operating procedures can't account for everything, every possible problem that might arise. And so unexpected, sometimes novel problems might arise that are not covered in the standard operating procedure, which requires engineers to then make a judgment, right? A kind of ethical decision-making about what they should do or what they should not do. Also, regulations cannot keep up with new safety knowledge, right? So there are regulations that exist. However, there can be new developments and new knowledge gained as far as making a certain product, such as a bridge, more safe that hasn't yet been updated in the current standard operating procedures and regulations and guidelines. It also could be the case that there might be new materials that might come into play when designing something. And since this is a kind of new material, there are kind of new kinds of safety issues that arise that are not even addressed in the standard operating procedures because this new material is just so new that there hasn't been time yet to implement certain kinds of regulations and rules in regards to this new material in the standard operating procedures and guidelines. So there are a variety of things that can arise. And this shows why just merely following the standard operating procedures is not enough. Right? And many times engineers are faced with having to make judgment calls on their own, ethical decisions in which human lives and human well-being can be at risk. And so what we have here is this notion of the standard of care. In order to address these possible situations and circumstances for engineers, engineers should follow the standard of care. So what this notion is saying, the standard of care, is that engineers must perform their jobs in accordance to what is ordinarily done by competent engineers and by what the public can reasonably expect. So this is a kind of vague notion, but the idea here is that we should rely on competent engineers. So these are engineers that are held to be in high standard, right, of high esteem. They're competent engineers, both in terms of their knowledge of engineering, technical knowledge like science and math, but also competent in the sense of their decision-making, which includes moral decision-making. So engineers must perform their jobs in accordance with what a competent engineer would do. Notice here, this has some similarities with virtue ethics about doing that act that the virtuous person would do. In this case, engineers should perform their jobs in accordance with what a competent engineer would do. And also by standards of what the public can reasonably expect. Right? People in the public, what's kind of reasonable that we would expect engineers to do in order to look out for the safety and well-being of others. So this notion of the standard of care, as I've said before, is used in law, where jurors make decisions based on expert testimony. So when, for example, an engineer or maybe a company is put on trial for perhaps negligence or making poor decision-making in regards to maybe one of their projects, jurors will be in part informed. So this is the kind of what the public can reasonably expect, right? It's the jurors making these decisions, but they're also in part informed by expert engineers who take the stand and say what an engineer should have done in that particular situation, right? Whether or not the engineer who's on trial met those standards or not. Okay, so to continue talking about the standard of care, engineers do make mistakes at times. And it's not the case that engineers are always responsible for those mistakes. They have made, at the time, sound moral decision-making in how they proceeded in their project, and they've applied their competent knowledge, science or math, etc., in the project itself. And it just so happened there was this glitch or maybe this problem that arose that, given their efforts, they really could not have accounted for. And this is normal in engineering, that sometimes mistakes are made. And sometimes there can be faults and problems with a particular product. However, if the error made by the engineer is negligent error, then the engineer is liable or responsible or blameworthy. Right? And many times there can be honest mistakes in which the engineer was not negligent. And we would say in those cases that the engineer is not liable in that situation or blameworthy. However, if the engineer makes an error that is a negligent error, then the engineer is liable. In other words, the engineer must exercise care. The engineer must follow the standards of care and must exercise care. And if the engineer does not exercise care and there is a problem with the product, then the engineer is liable and responsible for it. And as I've said before, or hinted at before, the standard of care is not a precisely defined line. So it is somewhat more loosely defined as being what competent engineers would do, as well as kind of reasonable public expectations. So just kind of the nature of the beast of trying to define the standard of care. This is kind of a notion that many people think is not something that we can precisely define. So there is a kind of more general, more loose definition of it. Okay, so next let's talk about responsible oversight. So this is when a product has been finished and all that's really needed is the engineer's kind of final stamp of approval. So kind of an oversight, a kind of big picture overlooking a project. Engineers should exercise care and oversight of a project when putting their final stamp of approval. And here are two situations. The first situation is one in which the relevant engineers did not exercise care. So for example, responsible monitoring and a few simple calculations when building a particular Kansas City hotel would have prevented a walkway collapse. So it was determined that if there actually had been responsible monitoring as competent engineers or a manager of engineers would do, or an engineer in a management position would do, then in that situation, along with just making some simple calculations, they would have been able to discover that this particular hotel had a walkway that was dangerous. What ended up happening was that the walkway ended up collapsing and falling on top of a party, and ended up being the case that 114 people died. In another situation here, we have an engineer of New York City's Citicorp building. Well, in his oversight, he determined that the major structural joints should have been deep welded rather than bolted together to combat the winds, right? The winds for tall buildings. Now, in this particular case, the kind of standard procedures, the New York City Building Code said nothing on the matter as far as whether or not you need to use whether the structural joints should have been deep welded or whether they should be bolted. So in this situation, the engineer exercised due care and reasonable care in this situation, and he did something extra. He reinforced the bolts to make them significantly stronger, and reinforcing the bolts allowed for the building to be safe. So that is an example of a virtuous engineer, right? In the oversight, realizing that using his moral imagination, realizing that if the building does collapse, how many human lives would be at stake, and the kind of risk he would be imposing on innocent human life. And so he did something about it, right? He reinforced the bolts. Okay, so at the same time, it can be the case that an entire organization can be responsible. As I've mentioned before, organizations as a whole can be responsible. For example, there can be a culture within an organization that doesn't exercise reasonable care. For example, you might have a culture where there's maybe a particular organization that relies on their past successes. Maybe they had many successful projects in the past, and they kind of just rely on that and say, oh, we are great. And so therefore they forego proper safety testing in present day or future projects because they're so enamored with their past successes and perhaps overly confident because of it. There can also be organizational barriers that limit communication of differences in opinion. So it would be important in a culture to have kind of an environment where engineers can kind of feel comfortable speaking their minds and their opinions, especially when there are safety problems that might arise, rather than having a situation where engineers who disagree tend to keep their mouths shut, right? Or they feel threatened if they open their mouths about a potential worry or concern. Also having an informal chain of command, right? Not having a strict chain of command where there's a hierarchy of managers, upper level management, etc., where there are direct decisions made, where given the chain of command, if someone higher up says something like, for example, that there's something wrong with this project and we need to change it, then it will actually occur, right? If it's too informal and there's really no set hierarchy and people really aren't listening to others in perceivably what might be considered to be a higher management position, but it's just so informal that people really don't pay attention to titles and things like that, that can lead to problems. So having a formal chain of command and being able to communicate with higher ups on that chain of command and having people in those higher up positions being morally responsible and making ethical decisions can all go towards creating the right kind of culture. And for those of you who are future engineers, it's also on you as well. You're part of that culture and you can make a difference within the company that you might be working for as far as creating the right kind of culture and encouraging others to speak their mind when they see a particular problem that might arise that could potentially threaten human life down the road. Okay, so here we have a particular important legal case, Coombs versus Bede, in engineering. And what came out of this case was a kind of emphasis on these ideas, that engineers are expected to act responsibly and with care. So this case is used as a precedent in other kinds of engineering legal cases and can be cited to emphasize that, bring up these points, that engineers are expected to act reasonably and with care. And there's a kind of analogy here that engineers carry the same responsibility as a doctor to her patient. Right? Just as a doctor is responsible for the patient and should try to take care of the patient as best as he or she can, engineers should also are responsible and should look out for the well-being of human beings that might in some way be tied to their project or product and whose lives might be affected adversely or even beneficially by it. And engineers also must hone their technical skills as well, constantly keeping up with new knowledge, fresh ideas that are coming out in the engineering world, making sure they have the technical, scientific, mathematical skills and are keeping up to date with new developments on it as well, in order to make sure that they create the best kinds of products or projects that can benefit society. Okay, and also liability, responsibility, moral blame can also fall on the individual level. And here are three kinds of harms that engineers should not commit. Intentional harm is knowingly and deliberately causing harm, knowingly and deliberately on purpose, maybe creating some kind of product that harms others. There's also reckless harm. This is where one doesn't necessarily intend to cause harm, but one is aware that harm is likely to result. There's a possibility, there's an increased risk that harm can result in innocent people. For example, driving fast, right? Driving fast way over the speed limit, you're not necessarily intending to harm someone, but you're being reckless. Right? You're doing something here where it's increasing the likelihood of harming others. So for reckless harm, this is when one intends behavior that is known to put others at risk, and it usually embodies a kind of having a reckless attitude, where the well-being of others is not in the front of one's mind. So the well-being of others should be kind of in the forefront of your mind as one is living life generally, but also in engineers, it should be in the forefront of your mind of who might be harmed by this product. Let's say if I decide to take option A rather than option B in designing this particular product. So it's important not to have a reckless attitude, but to always have in the forefront of your mind possibilities, right? Your moral imaginations, and for engineers to think about what kinds of effects it can have on others. Also, negligent harm. This is where an engineer overlooks or isn't aware of a factor that can cause harm, but if they had exercised due care and due responsibility, they would have been able to find that factor. So it's important not to be negligent in one's activities at work for engineers. Okay, so with that, that ends this particular lesson, and I will see you for the next one.